Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I had never been one to believe in superstitions or curses, but then again, I had never been haunted by a voice that seemed to know more about me than I did myself. It started innocently enough. An old radio, my uncle's, passed down to me after his sudden death. Nothing more than a relic collecting dust in the corner of my room. I'd always thought it was a strange, beautiful thing. It was old, worn, yet it had a certain character. My uncle used to play it late at night when I was a child. He never told me much about it, just that it had been in the family for generations. And maybe that should have been a warning right there. I don't know why I didn't throw it away sooner. Maybe I thought I was just tired, that I had too many things on my mind to notice the strange humming at night, or the faint whispers that started creeping from the static. The first night it happened, I thought I was losing my mind. I'd been up for days, caught in the grip of insomnia, the kind that turns the world into a series of shifting shadows and endless hours. I thought I'd heard the radio click on by itself. But no, that couldn't be right, it wasn't even plugged in. But then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the sound of a voice calling from the other room. I told myself I was just imagining things. Exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But as the minutes dragged on, the whisper grew clearer, more insistent. "We know you, Mark." I froze. My breath hitched in my chest. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be standing in the corner, but there was nothing. Nothing but the soft, oppressive hum of the static. And then it came again. "We know your fears." I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. The voice, it sounded like it was coming from everywhere, surrounding me. And it knew things. Things no one should have known. My childhood fears, my deepest regrets, secrets I'd buried in the back of my mind. How could it know? I rushed to the radio, hoping to silence whatever madness was creeping in. I unplugged it, yanked the cord free, threw it across the room, but still, the static persisted. The whispers clawed at my mind, growing louder, more desperate. "No matter what you do, Mark, you can't escape us." My heart raced. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, pressing down, suffocating me with their heavy silence. But the voices wouldn't stop. They were inside my head now, filling every corner of my thoughts. I tried to shake it off. I tried to go back to sleep. But the voices, they never left. They kept coming back every night, stronger, clearer. At first, they just whispered, like they were testing me, seeing how far they could push. But soon, they started saying things I couldn't ignore. Things I didn't want to hear. They began to talk about my life, my past. "You've always been afraid, Mark. You've always been alone." I couldn't explain it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I tried to move on with my life, but I couldn't. The voices were always there, always waiting. And no matter how much I tried to bury it, they kept calling. They knew. That's when I decided to find out where they were coming from. I had to know. I needed answers before I lost my mind completely. I went to Liam. He was the only person I knew who could help. He was the town's local radio expert. Eccentric, reclusive, and a little too obsessed with frequencies, but he was the only one who might have a clue about what was happening to me. His house was unsettling, to say the least. Located on the outskirts of town, it was surrounded by mist and strange, rusted equipment. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old radios, stacked in piles like tombstones marking a forgotten past. I could barely focus on anything. I only had one thought in my head: get rid of the voices. When I showed Liam the radio, his face paled. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at it as if it were some ancient artifact from a different time. A few moments later, he spoke, his voice trembling, almost as if he were afraid. "This radio, it's not just a radio," he said quietly, looking at me with wide, haunted eyes. "It's cursed. And now, it's calling for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. Cursed? What was he talking about? I didn't want to believe it. But as the words sank in, I realized he wasn't joking. He wasn't laughing. He was serious. Liam tried to explain, but before he could say anything more, the radio clicked on. I didn't touch it. Neither of us did. It just came alive, the static humming loudly in the room, filling the silence. And then, the voices. "They're coming, Mark." The voice sounded different this time. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a warning. Liam stumbled back, his face going pale, his breath ragged. He whispered something under his breath, but I couldn't understand him over the static. My heart pounded in my chest, panic bubbling up as I looked between the radio and Liam. And then, Liam collapsed. His body crumpled to the floor like a rag doll, lifeless, as the static around us grew louder. I couldn't understand what was happening. The radio had just taken him. I ran to him, tried to shake him awake, but it was too late. The voices, their voices, had claimed him. They'd stolen him away into the static. I was left alone in the room, gasping for air, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The radio, its dials now spinning wildly, sat untouched on the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was too late. The curse had already begun, and I was its next victim. "You belong to us now, Mark." The voices echoed in my ears. They were in my mind now. There was no escaping them, not anymore. I had never believed in curses or the supernatural, at least not until the night I realized I was listening to something that wasn't supposed to be heard. It all started with an old radio. My uncle's radio, to be specific. When he passed away, I inherited it. A strange, antique device, coated with years of dust, its brass dials worn and faded. I thought it was just another relic, an odd piece of memorabilia, something to tuck away and forget about, or maybe display on a shelf as a reminder of a man who had always seemed a little off. But I never should have plugged it in. The first night it happened, I thought I was imagining it. The thing wasn't even plugged in, for God's sake. But the static, the whispering voices began in the dead of night, as though the radio had come alive on its own. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, stress. But the voices knew things. Too many things. They spoke of my past, my childhood, things I hadn't thought of in years. "We know you, Mark." That was the first thing they said. I froze. I was alone in my apartment. I hadn't told anyone about the radio, hadn't even mentioned it to a soul. And yet, it knew my name. And then it got worse. The voices started to mention things about me, my deepest fears, the darkest corners of my life I had tried to bury. The radio wasn't on, it was off. But the voices, the static was alive, pulsing with energy. "We know your secrets, Mark. You can't hide from us." I didn't know what was happening. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was losing my mind, that the exhaustion was getting to me. But no matter what I did, the voices kept coming back. And they were getting clearer, louder. That's when I started looking for answers. There had to be an explanation for all of this. I wasn't crazy, right? Maybe it was the radio, something malfunctioning, something broken that was triggering my mind to hear things. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I had to stop it. So I went to Liam Harper, the local radio expert, the eccentric genius who lived on the outskirts of town. He was the only one who could help, or so I thought. The only person who might know what the hell was going on. Liam's house was a strange place, far from the clean, well-kept homes in the city. His house stood like a forgotten monument, surrounded by fog and shadows. There were no lights on the street, only the occasional flicker of lamplights dimmed by the thickness of the mist. It felt like stepping into another time. When I knocked, the door opened before I even had a chance to lift my hand. And standing there in the dim light was Liam, his wild eyes piercing through me, like he knew what I had come for. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't need to. He saw the fear in my face and the radio in my hands, and he knew. "Let me see it," he said, his voice low, filled with urgency. I handed it over reluctantly, the weight of the radio in my hands now feeling heavier than ever. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges with reverence. Or was it fear? I couldn't tell. "This," he said, his voice shaking. "This radio, it's not just a radio." I frowned, my confusion deepening. "What are you talking about?" Liam paused, his eyes darting from the radio to me, and then he whispered as though he were confessing a terrible secret. "It's a doorway, Mark, a doorway to something else, and it's been waiting for you." I laughed, a nervous, hollow sound. "A doorway? You're telling me the radio is haunted?" He didn't answer me. He didn't have to. Instead, he let the radio fall silent in his hands before he murmured something I couldn't quite catch. Something that sounded like a prayer, or maybe a warning. His eyes were wide, frantic, as if he was fighting to keep his composure. "It's not just static you're hearing," Liam said, his voice trembling. "The voices, they're souls, Mark. People who died while using this radio, people who got trapped in it. They can't escape. And now it's pulling you in." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath growing shallow. He wasn't making sense. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a joke, right? But then, as if to answer my disbelief, the radio came to life again. No, it wasn't even on, but the sound was there, filling the room with static. Only this time, it wasn't the soft whispering I'd grown used to. It was clear, unmistakable. "Liam, turn it off." The voice wasn't just a murmur. It was commanding. It was threatening. I turned to Liam, but he was already backing away, his eyes wide with terror, his face going pale. He seemed to know what was coming. "We know you, Liam." The voices grew louder, more persistent. "You can't escape us. None of you can." Liam was shaking now, his fingers clutching his chest, as if he were trying to keep his heart from tearing out of his ribcage. No, I didn't think." His words choked off as he gasped for breath, his face twisting with the same horror that had consumed me. And then, in a moment of sickening finality, Liam collapsed. His body hit the floor with a sickening thud, the static rising to a deafening pitch. I rushed to him, but it was too late. He was gone. Just gone. The voices, they had claimed him. And I was left standing in the silence, the cold radio still hissing in the corner of the room, like a monstrous thing that had just fed. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning, my thoughts incoherent. I'd come here for help, but what had I found instead? Another victim of the curse? Or was it too late for me to escape? The answer came to me in the form of a final whisper, cold and clear. "You belong to us now, Mark." And in that moment I realized there was no escaping. The radio had found me, just as it had found all the others before me. And soon, it would pull me under, just like it had pulled Liam. The voices were everywhere now. and I was part of them. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who believed in curses or the supernatural, but here I am, trapped in a nightmare I can't wake up from. I can't remember when it all started, when the static first became more than just noise, but I remember exactly when I realized I was no longer in control of my own mind. It was the radio that did it. The same old radio my uncle left me, a relic from another time, sitting quietly on my desk, waiting for me to listen. It all started innocently enough. At first, the whispers were just a faint hum in the background, barely more than static in my tired ears. But that first night I heard them clearly. "We know you, Mark." The words were so clear, so chilling, they cut through my exhaustion like a knife. I told myself I was imagining things, that my sleeplessness had finally pushed me over the edge. But every night the whispers came back, growing louder, more distinct. And it wasn't just any voice. It knew things. It knew things only I could know, things I'd buried long ago. I tried everything. I unplugged it. I smashed it. I even threw it out of the window. But no matter what I did, the radio always came back. The voices kept coming. They were never really gone. And the more I tried to escape them, the more they pulled me in. They knew me. And soon, they became a part of me. I couldn't sleep, not anymore. The nights bled into each other, a long stretch of endless hours, all filled with those voices. They spoke of my childhood, my deepest fears, my secret regrets. They didn't just whisper anymore, they commanded my attention. "We are always with you, Mark. You can't escape." It was like a rope tightening around my neck. The harder I fought, the more the rope pulled me in. I didn't know who to turn to, didn't know what to do, but then I remembered Liam. Liam Harper was the local radio expert, the guy who knew everything about old, strange devices. If anyone could help me, it was him. So, I drove out to his house, on the outskirts of town. His place was an old shack, surrounded by mist, a place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. When I knocked on his door, it swung open almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for me. I tried to explain, but Liam didn't need much explanation. He had seen it before. He took the radio from me, his hands trembling slightly as he inspected it, his eyes scanning over every inch of it. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at it like he was waiting for something. I felt my heart hammer in my chest, my mind racing. What was he thinking? Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just a radio, Mark. It's a doorway to something beyond, and it's been waiting for you." I laughed, nervous. A doorway? To what? Liam didn't laugh. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, his eyes flickering over to me. "The spirits. They've been trapped inside. They've died. They've gone. And they're using this radio to reach out. And now, Mark, they've found you." I thought he was joking. I had to. But when the radio crackled to life, a sharp, sudden hiss filled the room. I realized he wasn't kidding. "We know you, Liam." The voice was deep, chilling, and it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was like a hand wrapping around my throat. Liam backed away, his eyes wide with terror. He couldn't speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came. The room felt colder, the air thick with something heavy, suffocating. Then, without warning, Liam collapsed, crumpling to the floor as the static grew louder, drowning out his screams. I rushed to him, but it was too late. His body was cold, gone, and all I could hear was the relentless hum of the radio. The voices, they had taken him, they had consumed him. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling. Liam was gone. I was alone. The radio had claimed him, just like it was starting to claim me. But it didn't stop. The voices didn't stop. You belong to us now, Mark. You always have. The days after that were a blur. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The voices were always there. They spoke to me in the dead of night, in the quiet moments when I thought I might finally get some peace. Come closer. You're just like us, Mark. They were in my head now. They weren't just whispers. They were thoughts. They told me things, made me see things I couldn't tell anyone. Every part of me, my mind, my soul, was slipping further away. I spent hours with the radio, trying to understand it. I studied every crack, every detail, as if the answers were hidden within it. If I could just find the right piece of the puzzle. I had to understand. I had to stop it. But every time I tried to leave, every time I tried to run, the voices grew louder. You can't escape us. You belong here, with us. Claire, my girlfriend, started noticing the changes in me. She saw how distant I was, how I pulled away from her. She saw the way I was always listening. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't break free from the grip the radio had on me. One night, she begged me to let it go, to get rid of the damn thing. But I couldn't. The voices had consumed me. They were inside me now. She's next, Mark. She's already chosen. The words they spoke echoed in my mind like a death knell. I looked at Claire, and for the first time, I saw her differently. I saw her as just another victim, just another person to be claimed. The radio had taken Liam. It had taken me. And soon it would take her too. The curse wasn't just in the radio, it was inside me. It had always been inside me. I didn't know how to stop it. But I knew one thing for sure. There was no escaping it. There was no running from the static, from the voices. We are part of you now, Mark. We've always been part of you. And so, I stayed with it. I let the radio consume me. The static filled my head. I was no longer sure where I ended and it began. There was nothing left but the static and the cold, endless pull of the voices. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew. I was already one of them. There was no turning back. I used to think I was immune to the things that went bump in the night. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But now I'm not sure I'll ever sleep again. And it all started with an old radio. A radio that shouldn't have been mine. It was my uncle's, a relic. Old, worn, heavy with years and dust. When he passed, I inherited it. Didn't think much of it at first. Just another piece of junk sitting on a shelf, waiting to be forgotten. But one night, I found myself sitting in my dimly lit room, the radio humming softly beside me. I didn't think it was anything unusual at first. It wasn't plugged in fact, it wasn't even turned on. But I heard something beneath the hum, a voice. I told myself it was nothing. I was tired, too tired. The stress from work, the sleepless nights, they were all starting to take their toll. I thought I was just imagining things. But the voice was so clear, so familiar. And the longer I listened, the clearer it became. We know you, Mark. I froze. My blood ran cold. It knew my name. How? It wasn't possible. No one could know. No one could have said that. Not unless they were in the room with me. But I was alone. Or so I thought. The voice came again, and this time, it didn't just say my name, it knew things. Things only I knew. Things I had kept buried in the back of my mind. We know your fears. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard in my chest, I thought it might burst. I turned to the radio, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I tried to turn it off, to disconnect it. But the voice, it wouldn't stop. Even when I unplugged it, even when I threw it across the room, the voice kept coming, growing louder. Mark, you can't escape. At first, I thought I was just losing my mind. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, the exhaustion catching up with me. But the voices, they weren't just whispers anymore. They were commands. And they knew too much. They were inside my head, inside me. I couldn't escape. I didn't know how to stop it. The voice started to grow stronger, filling the silence of my apartment with its heavy presence. I tried everything. I smashed the radio, I burned it, I threw it away, but every night the static came back. Every night they were waiting for me. We are always with you. It felt like they were right behind me. Watching, I couldn't escape them. The voices became a part of me. They pulled at my mind, twisting my thoughts, breaking me down piece by piece. That's when I realized it wasn't just the radio, it was something worse. It was a curse. The radio wasn't some malfunctioning piece of equipment. It was alive, and it was hunting me. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know where to turn, so I went to Liam. He was the local radio expert, the one person who might know what the hell was happening. If anyone could help, it was him. His house wasn't far, tucked away on the edge of town. When I arrived, I felt an eerie chill in the air. The fog crept along the streets, and the closer I got to his house, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. The house was old, the kind of place that seemed to have forgotten time. Inside, it smelled of dust and old metal. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with radios of every shape and size, some functional, some long dead. But it was the radio I brought with me that caught Liam's attention the moment I stepped through the door. He didn't need an explanation. He saw the panic in my eyes, heard the tremor in my voice. He knew. When I handed it to him, he took it without a word, his fingers trembling as he turned it over. He inspected it, like he was searching for something buried inside it. I waited, my anxiety rising, but he didn't look at me. He was looking at the radio as if it held some terrible secret. "This," he said slowly, his voice low. "It's not just a radio." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, barely able to whisper the words. Liam didn't look up at me. His fingers brushed over the worn edges, his face pale with something that bordered on fear. "This radio," he continued, "it's a doorway. A doorway to something other." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What do you mean, other?" I asked. "It's just a radio. It's broken. It's old." "No, it's not just old," he interrupted, his voice shaking now. "It's cursed, and whoever comes into contact with it, it doesn't just listen. It pulls you in. They pull you in." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "They?" Liam finally looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "The voices you're hearing, Mark, their souls, trapped. They died, one by one, using this very radio, and now they're reaching out, and they've found you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. "Liam," I started, but before I could say anything else, the radio came to life. Not by my hand, not by any force of mine. It simply clicked on, the static crackling to life, filling the room with a low, oppressive hum. "We know you, Liam. We know you, Mark." Liam's face went ashen. He backed away from the radio, his legs giving way beneath him as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. The voices didn't stop. They just kept coming, louder now, their demands growing more desperate. No, I didn't think it would." Liam gasped, backing away further, his hand clutching his chest. "I didn't think you'd come this far." I stood frozen, unable to move, my mind reeling. The radio hummed louder, more aggressively, and Liam fell to his knees. And then he collapsed. His body hit the floor, lifeless, as the static grew louder. The voices didn't stop. They didn't stop for him, and they wouldn't stop for me. I dropped to my knees beside him, but there was no use. The radio was already claiming him, dragging him into its web, and all I could hear were the voices. "We have him, Mark. You'll be next." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The weight of what had just happened crushed me, and the static filled my ears, my head. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them, and in that moment I knew I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was part of it. The voices had claimed me. They were already inside me. "You belong to us now." And I couldn't run, because there was no place to run. I never believed in curses. I didn't believe in ghosts, in haunted things, or in any of the stuff that people say happens to those who venture too far into the unknown. I used to think I was rational, grounded, that I was too sensible for superstitions. But now, I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is this: I can't escape. I can't run. And it's all because of the radio. It wasn't anything special at first. It was my uncle's, a relic that had sat in the back of my closet for years. I wasn't even sure why I kept it, but after his death, I felt some strange obligation to keep it, as if the radio itself was a piece of his spirit, something left behind, waiting to be remembered. But I never thought it would be this way. The whispers started a few days after I brought it out of the closet. At first, it was just faint, just static, something you could ignore. But then, they began to speak. Soft, hollow voices that seemed to flicker in and out of the static. I thought I was losing it. I thought it was my exhaustion getting the better of me, my insomnia twisting my thoughts. But it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. They knew things. Things only I could know. "We know you, Mark." It was a whisper at first, barely audible, but it hit me like ice water. My breath caught in my chest. I looked around. No one was there. I thought I was imagining it, or maybe it was some random interference, but the voice came again. "We know your fears." How? How did it know? I didn't tell anyone about my fears. No one could have known. No one except me. The static grew louder, more insistent, more alive. It surrounded me like a physical force, pressing in on me until I couldn't think straight anymore. The room felt colder, darker, as though something was creeping just beyond my vision. I tried to fight it. I unplugged the radio, threw it out, smashed it to pieces, but every time I tried to shut it out, it came back. Every time, the whispers came with it. "We are waiting for you, Mark." The more I tried to stop it, the worse it became. They spoke of things only I knew, things that no one else could have possibly known. Memories I'd buried, fears I hadn't shared with a soul. It felt like they were inside my mind, twisting everything, changing everything until I didn't know what was real anymore. And then, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I went to Liam. He was the local radio expert, an odd man to say the least, but he knew things. He had to know what was happening to me. So I grabbed the radio and drove to his house. His house was far out on the outskirts of town, a place that felt as if it had been forgotten by time. The fog wrapped around it like a thick shroud, and the air smelled musty, filled with the scent of old machinery and forgotten dreams. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of dust and metal. Radios were stacked everywhere, piled high in every corner of the room, like old tombstones of a lost era. Liam didn't say anything when I handed him the radio. He just stared at it, his fingers trembling as he traced the edges. His face went pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? It wasn't until he finally spoke that I realized how deep the darkness ran. This radio isn't just a radio," he said, his voice shaking. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. What's happening to me? Why is this happening? Liam looked at me, his gaze intense, his lips pressed into a thin line. This radio, it's not just a device, it's a doorway, and whoever listens to it becomes a part of it. They become part of the static. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. A doorway? To what? To the dead, Liam whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The people who've owned this radio before you, they all died. But they didn't just die, Mark. They became trapped in the static, and now it's calling for you. The room seemed to tilt, like the ground beneath me had shifted. I laughed nervously. That's crazy. You're telling me this thing is haunted? That it's some kind of curse? Liam's eyes darkened. You don't understand. It's not just a curse, it's something much worse. The spirits inside the radio, they feed on fear. They know you. They know everything about you. The static roared to life suddenly, louder than before, filling the room with a deafening hum. I froze. I didn't even have time to speak before the voices came again. But this time, they weren't whispers. They were screams. Liam! The static hissed as it spoke. The voices called his name, his real name, and the moment they did, Liam's face twisted in fear. He tried to speak, tried to warn me, but it was too late. The static consumed him. I watched in horror as his body fell to the floor, limp, lifeless. The radio continued to crackle, the voices echoing in the air like the screams of the dead. Liam was gone, taken by the static. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on me. The radio wasn't just a device anymore. It was a prison for the souls of those who had been foolish enough to listen, to allow it to claim them. And now, I was next. The voices were louder now, their demands more urgent. Mark, you belong to us. I tried to run. I tried to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the radio had me bound, tied to it by invisible threads. I couldn't escape. And then I heard her voice. Claire's voice. It was distant, but it was real. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale with concern. But when she saw the radio, when she saw me, her eyes went wide with terror. She knew. She could feel it too. Mark, what's going on? What's happening to you? Her voice broke through the static, but it didn't matter. The radio was louder now, drowning her out. The voices, the souls trapped inside the radio, they were closing in on us. She's next, Mark. I turned to her, but I couldn't reach her. The static had already wrapped itself around me, and now it was starting to drag her in too. I wanted to scream, to warn her, but the words were stuck in my throat. The static was too strong. It was too late. She fell to her knees, the static now pulling her into the darkness, just like it had done to Liam, just like it had done to me. The screams grew louder, the voices filling my mind, until there was nothing left but the sound of the static. And then, there was nothing. We were all part of it now. The radio had claimed us, and there was no escape. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who believes in curses or ghosts or any of that nonsense. I always thought I was too grounded, too rational for that kind of thing. But now, I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is this: there's no escape, there's nowhere left to run. And it all started with the radio. At first, it was just an old thing, a relic that had sat in my closet for years. It was my uncle's radio. I didn't think much of it when I inherited it. It was a heavy, dusty thing with brass dials that had been worn down by time. It didn't seem like anything special, but something changed the moment I plugged it in. At first, I thought I was imagining things, the hum, the crackling noise, the way the static filled the air. But then, I heard it. A voice, soft, almost like a whisper, barely audible above the noise, but it said my name. Mark. I froze. My blood ran cold. No one was here. I was alone. It couldn't have been real, could it? But then it came again. The voice, clear and distinct this time. We know you, Mark. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My hands trembled. I looked at the radio, trying to figure out what was happening. It wasn't even on. It wasn't plugged in. But still, the voice continued, growing louder, clearer. We know your fears. I couldn't breathe. How did it know that? How did it know things no one else could possibly know? I wanted to turn it off. I wanted to throw it out the window, break it into 1,000 pieces. But no matter what I did, the voice didn't stop. It just kept coming, growing stronger with every passing night. The static became more than just noise. It became alive. It became real. I couldn't escape it. It haunted me. It followed me. The voice started saying things I couldn't ignore, things I didn't want to hear. You can't hide from us, Mark. You never could. The whispers started seeping into my thoughts. The radio wasn't just a device anymore. It was inside me, pulling at my mind, dragging me further into its dark, twisted world. I was losing myself, bit by bit, and I couldn't stop it. That's when I went to Liam. He was the only one who might understand, who might know what was happening to me. He was the local radio expert, an eccentric genius, a hermit of sorts, but I needed answers. I couldn't live like this anymore. His house was on the outskirts of town, tucked away in the fog. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen the light of day in years. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of mildew and rust. Inside, the place was cluttered with radios, some old, some new, all of them in varying stages of disrepair. It was a mess, but it was his world, his obsession. He didn't look surprised when I showed him the radio. It was like he'd been waiting for me. He didn't say anything at first. He just took the radio from my hands, his fingers trembling as he inspected it, his face pale as if he had seen something he wasn't supposed to. After a long silence, he finally spoke. This radio, he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not just a radio, it's a doorway. I stared at him, my mind racing. A doorway? What was he talking about? A doorway to what? I asked, my voice shaking. Liam's eyes darkened, his face twisting with a kind of fear I'd never seen before. A doorway to the dead, he muttered, his words barely audible. The souls of those who used this radio, they're trapped. And now, Mark, they've found you. They've found us. I felt a chill run through me. What do you mean, found us? What's happening? Liam's face twisted in agony. The voices, they're not just voices. They're the souls of the dead, trapped in the static, and they feed on fear. They latch onto the weak, the broken, and now they've latched onto you. I wanted to laugh. It sounded insane, but I couldn't. Because everything Liam was saying, it felt real. The radio, the voices, they had known things about me. They had been with me every night, growing stronger, more insistent. The radio crackled to life again, louder this time. Liam, turn it off. You can't escape us. Liam's face went pale. He stepped back, his hands shaking. No, it's too late now. Before I could respond, Liam fell to his knees. His eyes went wide, his chest heaving with panic. He gasped for air, but nothing came. His body jerked once, twice, and then went still. Dead. The radio's static roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. Liam was gone, just like that, taken by the static. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The radio was still crackling, still calling to me. I tried to scream, to run, but it was too late. I had already been marked. The voices had already taken me. And now, They were coming for everyone. I didn't know how much time passed after that. My mind was spinning. I was lost. I couldn't think. I could only hear the static, feel the pull of the voices. And then, through the fog, I heard her voice. Claire's voice. My heart skipped a beat. "Mark, please, what's happening to you?" She stepped into the room, her eyes wide with concern. But the moment she saw the radio, the moment she saw me, she stopped. Her face went pale, her breath hitching in her throat. She felt it. She could feel the presence, the pressure in the air, just like I did. The static was everywhere now. It wasn't just in the radio anymore. It was in the room. It was in us. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going on? You have to stop this." But I couldn't. I couldn't stop it. The voices had taken root in me. I was already gone. I could feel the static growing louder, closing in on her. She couldn't escape it. No one could. I reached out for her, but it was too late. The static swallowed her words, drowned out her scream. Her body jerked once, twice, and then she collapsed, just like Liam. The static took her, and I knew that there was no escaping it now. The radio had claimed us. It had claimed Liam. It had claimed Claire. And now I was a part of it. I was one of them. "We are always here, Mark." And I understood then. I wasn't the last. I was just the beginning. The static wasn't finished yet. It would never be finished. It would always be waiting, always calling for the next one. The voices would always find someone. And now I was waiting too, just like the others. Trapped in the static forever. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.